Very good. Well, good morning. I'm Warren Hogue, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this speaker series event featuring Bert Koenders, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, who will be speaking to us on the subject, the UN at 70, Partnering for Peace, Justice, and Development. As we indicated in the invitation that has brought so many of you here this morning, he will be discussing the future of the UN and the need to invest in enhancing peace operations, improving humanitarian assistance, and achieving sustainable development goals. And of course, after his remarks, we will have a question and answer period so we and he can find out what is on your minds. I'm happy to say that I've had the pleasure of welcoming Bert Koenders here 3 times in just 2 years. The first was in January 2013 when he was the special representative of the Secretary General for Côte d'Ivoire, and the second in October of that year, by which time he had become the SRSG for Mali. In an interview I had with him during that second visit for our Global Observatory website, I concluded by saying, "Well, Bert Koenders, you take on the tough assignments. And I'm glad that in all these cases you come to IPI and tell us what you are doing, why you're doing it, and I invite you to come back. You don't have to come up with another job or another country." Well, as you can see, he has come up with another job, a high-profile one, and he is representing another country, his own. And in that role, he will be keeping up his deep engagement with the work of the UN since the Netherlands is a candidate for the Security Council in 2017-18. In informal conversations I have with people about the UN, I often say that there are a few essential countries here, a few countries with a vocation for international action and multilateral diplomacy and a generosity of spirit without which the UN simply would not work. High on that list is the Netherlands. And IPI has had the pleasure of partnering with the Dutch on many occasions in the years I have been here. And Bert Koenders has a particular vocation for the kind of work we look to the United Nations for. I've mentioned the 2 SRSG positions, but in addition, he's a seasoned international policymaker on development, humanitarian, governance, and conflict management issues. And he has also been the Dutch Minister for Development Cooperation and a member of the Dutch House of Representatives. This is a time when a lot of discussion and thought around here falls under the rubric of the post-2015 agenda. And so for all these reasons, we were delighted when Bert Koenders contacted us last month and said he would like to speak here about the UN at 70. So Bert, a very warm welcome back to IPI and the UN community, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be back here again. Thank you very much for inviting us. I'm always glad to be at IPI. I think it's an area and a place where we can have free speech. We can talk about important issues. I've always been honored and very pleased to be here. And not only is this a perfect location across the street from the United Nations, but I think it's also a place of real debate, of free speech, of questions and answers, of listening to you, what you feel is very important at the moment in the United Nations that can help us as well, in this case, me as Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, to have the right policies when we bring our opinions to the floor across the street. I think this place where we are today is even more important in the time that we are speaking. First of all, we have more than ever an obligation to speak to each other. I think diplomacy is more important than ever. There's a lot of issues in the world right now in which it's difficult to get to agreement, in which we speak in different languages. Diplomacy is very fierce. And at the same time, I think there is an enormous opportunity here in IPI, but especially in the United Nations, to come to agreement. As a former head of 2 peacekeeping operations and as a former development minister, I feel that the United Nations is the headquarters of our common destiny. I'm glad to be back now as Minister of Foreign Affairs for my own country, and I hope we can and we will be, I think, an effective ally in support of a reformed, modern and up-to-date United Nations. A place where people connect who want to make a difference. Allow me to dwell a little bit more on this last point. And let me start further uptown at Columbia University, where the acclaimed modern and intellectual historian Mark Mazower is a professor. I guess some of you, and especially those who follow the United Nations very carefully and very precisely, know his book Governing the World, The History of an Idea, published in the autumn of 2012, and it traces the origins of the idea of a well-governed world. Now, Professor Mazower, and that is correct, I think, he doesn't spare the United Nations, nor should he. Like any other organization, the United Nations can benefit from criticism. But his conclusion has a gloomy cast to it. Although realism and idealism have always been present in international affairs, and I guess actually they should be combined in our real policy making, Mazower laments the current state of international politics. He fears that the inherently idealistic goal of a well-governed world is being lost. I do not share his pessimism, although there is reason to worry. I think we all realize that. Reason to worry, think about the important year of 2014. Lack of unity in the Security Council to solve large crises in the world, from eastern Ukraine to Syria. Fierce language, I mentioned it already, and more dissent when it comes to issues of interpretation of human rights, of freedom of religion, of freedom of speech. And therefore diplomacy is so important, and I think has a new reason for it. It's not the old-fashioned trade of being diplomats. It's more than ever being the bridge between cultures, between countries, to govern the world. So maybe there is some reason for some pessimism, yes. But I think the book has also an uplifting quality. As a pragmatic idealist, I take from it the thought that sheer collective willpower is sometimes all it takes to change the world for the better. And in his book, he gives very good examples of that. Let's look at the present. The year 2014 was difficult, yes, for the world community. We faced very many unexpected and sometimes expected crises. We witnessed the highest number of refugees ever since the Second World War, including IDPs. There were more level 3 emergencies. The most extreme crises we have seen are very severe. With the MH17 tragedy, the Kingdom of the Netherlands experienced in a very direct way how intertwined today's global crises are. Foreign affairs became terribly personal for many of my compatriots, as we lost almost 200 citizens, but also for many families around the world. We are still working hard with all those involved to facilitate the investigations, with the aim of holding those responsible to account. But it brought also in my country, like in many other countries, home that international conflicts, that crises can touch individual citizens even far away. And therefore, again, internal and foreign policy become more than ever related. I think in itself that's a positive development. I think here at the United Nations we always look out for the risks that we are not seen as some cosmopolitan elite that forget the interests of the citizens of the world. And some of the citizens of the world are living in their own states and they become more and more provincial. They want to defend themselves against the risks of the rest of the world. We have to be the bridge makers. The foreign ministers, the diplomats, those that make the bridge between local and international. That's our task. The year 2014 showed how important the United Nations can be. The Secretary General responded to the Ebola crisis by establishing UNMIR, and I think that was a crucial step made in conjunction with the region of West Africa and with some key countries. I think that's a way to work. It has to be an orchestra of the United Nations and member states, not as one above the other, but in close connection with each other. And my colleagues, the Minister of Defense and Minister of Development Cooperation in my own government, went to visit just recently. We have sent our Navy vessel, the Karel Doorman, has been transporting vital supplies from the international community. And our joint fight against Ebola is showing, in that context of an orchestra, results. Liberia, Guinea and Sierra Leone have reported their lowest weekly total of newly confirmed cases. And we should obviously continue to follow developments very closely. But I was happy that the country where I've worked in till recently has just been able to report that there are no cases, no new cases in Mali. Even after the immediate crisis, we need to support these states in the fragile phase of recovery. Above all, we should isolate the disease and not the countries. I think it's very important to try to limit the negative economic and social consequence of the Ebola outbreak. I mentioned the Ebola outbreak as a way where the United Nations was very vital, was very key, in an orchestra with different countries. But we all realize that this terrible disease could not have spread without the enormous public health crisis in West Africa. And so we have to learn from that as well. Those who've worked for many, many years in West Africa have to realize that in the end, many of their policies were not successful. It could not have been spreading as fast if there was not a crisis of public health already in West Africa. And also we realize the WHO was crucial in this crisis. And we understand more than ever that we need the WHO, but also its innovation and its reconstruction. Therefore, I think it's important that when we talk about 2014, we see the enormous possibility and also the strengths of the United Nations, but also to look at the needs that are so apparent. I don't have to mention them here. We are discussing them every day. We're looking at humanitarian cooperation. We're organizing also in the context of our country with others a humanitarian summit. Not a summit just to talk again, but to think through when we see the underfunding of appeals around the world, how we can ensure that there's more predictability in humanitarian finance, how we can look at the relationship between humanitarian recovery and early recovery, and how we can become more preventative. This is not a new agenda, but it stretches from the importance that we have seen after the Ebola crisis. There were other issues, I go very quickly through them in 2014, where I've seen so many people admiring the United Nations. I had my colleague Hilda Johnson in Sudan opening up the camps of the United Nations mission. It was a courageous step to take in her peacekeeping mission, which created a safe haven for thousands of innocent civilians in South Sudan. We have seen the importance of the OPCW UN mission led by Sigrid Kaag, my capable former colleague at the United Nations, successfully completing the elimination of Syria's declared chemical weapons program. I can go on, but I think we have to realize at 70 also where we see that there are shortcomings. I mentioned the Security Council, paralyzed in responding to the atrocities in Syria. And over the Christmas holidays, I was in touch with courageous people in Aleppo. And we did it basically by internet, talking to the people who are now in Aleppo. I think the world still has not realized sufficiently the enormous suffering that is taking place. We'll talk about it maybe a little bit later, but I think Aleppo could be the icon of a place we cannot fail. The humanitarian community cannot fail, but also those who look for a political strategy to solve that problem. Second, the Mdgs. I remember in 2000, everybody was skeptical about the Mdgs. I think major progress was made. That means the common effort of people, of communities, of NGOs, of countries can make a difference. Now, 800 million people still suffer from hunger. And even if the MDGs are reached, substantial poverty will remain in LDC. So it's a second area where we will have to continue to work on. And thirdly, despite Resolution 1325, women are still not involved in many peace processes. The IPI has done marvelous research, and they say that women constitute only 9% of peace negotiators. And when I was negotiating in Algiers not long ago, or the Mali Peace Conference, we saw nobody, not one woman was present. I'll explain a little bit about that later, because in fact the women were present a little bit at a distance. If you look to the Tuareg women, some of my African colleagues here know that, actually the men are the boss when it comes to Tuareg. So they send the men to the peace negotiations, and then they go back to get a yes or a no. So it doesn't always say that when women are not there, it doesn't work. But obviously, it is dismal that we are talking for many, many years about 1325. We'll talk about it this afternoon in a special event, that in practice, often they are absent. And we have to think through why that actually is the case. I think 2014, and I'm coming now to some of the ideas for the future, and that is, I think, the best to discuss this in question and answers. But the United Nations is now turning 70. But even at 70, the United Nations still has a lot of growing up to do. This is not the world of 1945. I don't have to go in those cliches, I think. But a new legitimacy is needed. And that is a world where the trend towards fewer conflict has come to a halt. Armed conflict is now the leaders' biggest fear, according to the World Economic Forum's recent report, Global Risk 2014. I think many people move to Davos this week. That will be the issue. new insecurity, hybrid warfare, new risks, insecurity. That is at the top of the agenda internationally right now. And it goes beyond the economy at this point, if you look to the concerns of many people and many leaders. And the United Nations will therefore have to be again better prepared for a world in greater turmoil. And the great Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations from a few years ago, Jean-Marie Guénaud, president of now the International Crisis Group, mentioned it also. Stabilizing the world's most vulnerable areas should be a major global foreign policy imperative and not just a moral one, given that these regions often serve as a haven for terrorists and transnational criminals. Some people have also here have referred to the tragic events in Paris. And it's true that the UN plays a key role also in addressing this phenomena. We need it every day. I was yesterday in Brussels talking to the colleagues, Minister of Foreign Affairs. We're talking about how to combat terrorism and extremism. And I think the United Nations played a key legitimate role and also legal role to ensure that the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters stopping the flow of financial resources are the crucial elements to fight this problem. But we should not only look at this, but also at the origins, the complex origins of terrorism. I think here the United Nations comes in as well. I think it should help to shape a narrative that provides an alternative to radicalization based on human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and all the other universal values that humanity shares. An alternative narrative that also makes room for an understanding of local realities. Diplomacy and dialogue, not force alone, are the factors that can eventually lay conflicts to rest. And it's time for an intensive dialogue that leaves no space for arrogance, no space for double standards or propaganda. And let the United Nations today do once again what we founded it to do, provide a platform that promotes dialogue, not just between civilizations, but also within these civilizations, to address the root causes of terrorism. We need to formulate a response to the many challenges we faced in 2014. I mentioned them, Ebola, but also the structural causes behind it. The issue of strengthening peacekeeping operations in a time of hybrid warfare. And thirdly, also this issue of preventative diplomacy combined with talking in the United Nations on counter-narratives. In this speech, I would like to highlight 4 areas where we, member states, can all help the United Nations become more effective. Ending poverty, supporting peace and protecting civilians, and advancing women's rights. And fourthly, I think is very key, reforming the Security Council and supporting the Secretary General's reform efforts. Let me mention shortly each of those 4 so that we can go to the next phase of our discussions. But I think it's important, these are old themes, but they have to be carried out in a new way. The world has changed. That means it's not only the goals that have to be adapted to a new world, but also the way we function, the way we organize ourselves. Not in the realities of the 20th century, but really of the 21st century. Let me start by ending poverty, respecting the planet and meeting special needs. In September, we need to agree ambitious and well thought out sustainable development goals that will help end poverty by 2030. The United Nations has managed to galvanize unprecedented support for the Mdgs. The critics were out there, and we see that they were wrong. For the first time, everyone agreed on the road to ending poverty. Can lightning strike twice? That's now the question. Can we make the road to dignity, as the Secretary General said, become a reality? I believe we can. I think we have made progress on this. And I think ending poverty is the most important goal on this agenda. Over 1 billion people are still poor. So in that sense, the MDGs have a long road to go, and also the way they are implemented. We are more than ever in a world of inequality. Freeing poverty requires tackling inequality and protecting people's human rights. Secondly, I think it's important to talk about the word inclusive growth. Worldwide, we see jobless growth. If I worked in Mali or in West Africa, and we talk about terrorism and insecurity, we know it is directly related to jobless recovery, jobless growth, and no future for many people. And it's not only in West Africa, it's in many regions in the world. When we talk about MDGs, we have to relate it to economic policies of ending poverty and promoting inclusive growth. And I think we also need to emphasize the universal character of the agenda. I think we are now going in the right direction. We should go in that direction, continue to make sure that it is linked to financing. You can have a lot of nice goals. If there's no financing, forget it. So financing for development is a key conference. Like in Monterey, we have to really think through how this can be a success in a completely different world economy, but with the same questions. Where are the real flows in terms of investment, in terms of credits, etc., etc. The needs of LDCs, Africa, the small island states and conflict-affected countries should be, in my view, prioritized. It will be at the African Union Summit next week. I will also go there to discuss with the African Union's leaders for the issues of the post-2015 agenda as formulated in the Common African Position. We are happy to be a partner, as the Netherlands, for countries around the world in finding sustainable and innovative solutions for these issues, including water and climate. Our kingdom is surrounded by water on almost all sides. The Netherlands is a delta country with more than half of its population living below the sea level. And then we have Aruba, Curaçao and Sint Maarten. They are small island developing states. And for our kingdom together, water is both an asset and a challenge. The Netherlands, Aruba, Curaçao and Sint Maarten are all threatened by climate change and rising sea levels. Therefore, Paris is so important to become successful at the end of the year. And we have to do it very effectively, with new ways of negotiating, with looking at where the interests of the different countries lie, and I see already developments there in the discussion that are positive. It's not only the deal between the US and China, it is also the latest COP in Lima that gave us some ideas how we can advance the discussion, but we are not there yet. And I think we also have to think through how we can adapt our innovation, our businesses, our public partnerships on working on climate, on agriculture and other areas. Second, supporting peace, protection, civilians after the development issue, a modern approach to development cooperation. I think also some strengthening of the development institutions and reform of the development institutions of the United Nations, but supporting Ban Ki-moon in his agenda, in Paris and on the Millennium Development Goals. Second order. Second is supporting peace and protecting civilians. We were talking about conflict. We are talking about the fact that we have new conflicts. Hybrid warfare where, groups are at the same time territorial, like Daesh, where they have guerrilla tactics, where they have terrorist tactics, where they have classical warfare tactics, and where we see a growth of political technology through social media. Extremely effective. Do we really have an answer to this conflict in our peacekeeping operations, in our preventative efforts, in the way we deal with this? I think not, and I cannot blame anybody for it, because it's extremely complex. But I think we need, again, as United Nations, to prioritize conflict-affected areas, and that's why we support, as the Netherlands, the work of UNDPA. We also have to work on the effectiveness of peacekeeping operations. I've been working on 2 peacekeeping operations in Côte d'Ivoire and Mali. We'll discuss it more deeply, maybe in a discussion and also later on today. But we all know that it's important that we have to review what we are doing. I think the initiative of Secretary General is extremely timely, a review of peacekeeping operations. We had Brahimi in 2000, so we have 2015. We have to look what was the real message of Brahimi, and are we still on the right track when it comes to the relationship between mandate and means, between mandate and implementation, between troop contributing countries and what we really need on the ground. It should not only be the countries that are the poorest in the world that supply the troops for these peacekeeping operations. I'm proud that my country is now moving on very strongly in Mali to make sure that there are the countries of the world that contribute to peacekeeping operations. We have to think through how we can innovate it. There is the brigade in Congo, and I hope they will act very soon with the FDLR in the coming days and weeks. We have the need for information in peacekeeping operations. A few years ago, the word intelligence could not be used in the United Nations. Why not? If you are the head of a UN peacekeeping operation, you don't know what's happening. How can you effectively protect civilians? It's definitely impossible. If we want to protect women who go to a marketplace, that is Resolution 1325. We need the intelligence and the eyes and ears on the ground. That's why we have innovated, the United Nations has innovated peacekeeping in Mali on this. But we are not there yet. when we talk about the issue of the real political solutions to these type of conflicts, because in the end there is not a military answer alone. And we have to build really on one United Nations also in the early recovery phase. I remember coming to Mali, but also to the Ivory Coast. There are some very good experts here that know this, who've worked on preventative diplomacy. And you go to the north where the biggest problem is. There was a complete absence of NGOs, of UN agencies. That is, I think, the second element of reform that is crucial. On poverty and innovation. Secondly, on the issue of peacekeeping and protection civilians. The third one I wanted to mention very quickly is the issue of supporting women's rights. Also there, of course, this is not a new discussion. We have had big conferences with enormous amount of positive output. We should not underestimate the role of the United Nations in norm setting, in setting discussions in the world on women's rights, on gender, on human rights, and so on and so forth, even if they're culturally sensitive. And each country will have to find out their own ways of doing it. It's not something that should be pushed from above. There are different cultural interpretations to universal rights. But when we come to women's rights, I think there is still a lot of work to do. The United Nations must keep the promises we've made to the world's women. I already spoke about the key role women play in development and the potential being left untapped. I'm very proud of my own Queen, Her Majesty Queen Maxima, who as the Secretary General's Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance for Development is working to make sure that women in particular have access to financial services. I mentioned the issue of 1325. Let that not be a ritual. 1325 is not a piece of paper. It is about participation actively. We see that many women are resilient in the face of conflict and oppression. The Guardian recently reported on women in Timbuktu, in Mali, who reclaimed their space after the Islamists had left. And Mint Mohammed, a female member of parliament, is quoted as saying, "Timbuktu is lucky because of its name, its cultural heritage, saints and women. Timbuktu was founded by a woman. Today the United Nations force in Timbuktu is led by a woman. We've had many great women, and that is why Timbuktu has women in authority today." These women and their stories can inspire us to continue converting 1325 into real action. And men and women should work on this together. Then my fourth point, and that is reform of an effective United Nations. Those who've worked in the United Nations and have been active that for many years, we always talk about reform of the United Nations. There's nothing wrong with that because we always have to reform because the world is changing quickly. We have new power structures in the world, rising powers, declining powers. We have new actors, we have hybrid warfare, we have very positive developments as well in terms of reducing poverty, in universalizing at least the legitimacy of human rights. But it's a world that everybody feels is also full of insecurity. And therefore the traditional way we look at the United Nations as the world government top down is going to organize all problems of global governance. It's not going to be the model. The question is, what is the model? I think nobody will be able to write that cast in iron in a beautiful piece of paper. I think that would be even counterproductive because we need speed, we need flexibility, and we need diplomacy and a real discussion between countries on how we deal with global issues as the ones I just mentioned. I think we should not forget, and I'm sure the people here don't do that the United Nations is a beacon of hope for so many in the world because of its role in defending justice. The protests outside here in Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza are not always pleasant maybe, but they are a sign of how important the United Nations is in so many people's eyes. That is why those responsible must be held accountable for the crimes committed in Syria. That is why we need peace in the Middle East. That is why the Netherlands, as a major donor to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, believes that more resources from the regular UN budget should go to human rights. We are bound by our Constitution to strengthen the international legal order. That's why we are happy to host the International Court of Justice and other legal institutions in The Hague. And we need to make tangible progress towards Security Council reform. I think that's always the elephant in the room. Let's be open about it. We urgently need a more effective and legitimate Security Council that reflects today's realities. I was working before in the IMF and the World Bank as a Minister of Development for the Netherlands. There automatically changes came about in the power structure of these institutions because of the reality of financial markets. The institutions could not be effective without change. Change in representing those who were not represented. I think that obviously, in a very different way, should also happen in the Security Council. And we talk about it many years, but I think there are also possibilities to move forward in a way that is maybe a medium-term adaptation to what is necessary before we go into all kinds of long-term necessities of reform. The Council needs to address conflicts that cannot be ignored. In conflicts in places like Syria and Ukraine and in combating terrorism, the Council should make a difference. If we want to get better at building peace, the Security Council has to change. While it has taken some steps towards more open debates and sessions, and I want to applaud also my Luxembourg colleague, he's here as a permanent representative, who has been such a force of creating humanitarian access in Syria, helping me when I was special representative in Mali. This council is key for all peace operations, for everybody who is there. And therefore it needs to be strengthened, and yes, it needs to be reformed. We are not necessarily in favor of new veto rights, but what I like is an important proposal of the French to restrict the use of the veto in the Security Council for mass atrocities. We also support the United Nations Secretary General vision for the United Nations in 2015, which he set out earlier this year. And what could I do? He was my former boss, and I think he's absolutely on the right track. He should be supported in that. And I think also I welcome his pleas, which was not easy in this time, for tolerance in the face of the threats, the initiative to put human rights up front, and his championing of LGBT rights. At the same time, we need a United Nations that is united and fit for purpose. As I said earlier, at 70, the United Nations needs to grow up. I've seen firsthand how far we still have to go. More leadership and greater efforts are urgently needed to make one UN a reality. We are not having the impact we should because of our efforts are too compartmentalized. And as a result, we miss opportunities to bring peacekeeping missions, for instance, to a rapid and successful end, because they should end. We always have to need an exit strategy. In conclusion, and I'm already too long, so we can go to the discussion. The Kingdom of the Netherlands lies partly in Europe and partly in the Caribbean. Our transatlantic location links 2 continents and several groups of countries. We are a gateway to both Europe and Latin America, and we appreciate the challenges faced by small island developing states, especially when we move up to Paris later this year. Our unique location gives us a keen eye for opportunities. Let me return for a moment to Professor Mazower, who sits there in Columbia University. His book, Governing the World, is quite pessimistic, at times even cynical. And if we look at today's world, it is sometimes hard not to be depressed. The challenges the world community faces are enormous. Last year, we saw some appalling atrocities, I mentioned them. This year started off terribly, with the brutal massacre of over 2,000 people by Boko Haram in Nigeria, and the monstrous terrorist attack in Paris. But if we think like pessimists, we risk acting like pessimists. As I said at the beginning, the United Nations is the headquarters for all those who want a better world, for all of us who want to be realistic optimists. Like the crowds everywhere who marched for freedom of expression after the tragedy in Paris. And it came from all over the world, from Africa. I saw President Keita there in front with the French president, colleagues and ministers from all over the world, in fact. The Netherlands believes strongly in its partnership with the United Nations for these elements: peace, justice, and development. Yeah, that is, I come at the end, of course, to a little bit of propaganda here. I can't help it. That's why we are a candidate for the Security Council for the 2017-18 term. We are a contributor to UN peacekeeping. We are the host country for international institutions that help sustain the international legal order. We are a major donor of, can I go on? Is this? We are a major donor of development and humanitarian aid and one of the top contributors to the United Nations. So we are ready to serve on the Security Council and join in working for peace, justice, and development in partnership with you. Thank you very much.
Now you want to turn that thing on now. You know where it is?
Maybe she knows. You know how it goes.
You have to do another piece of housekeeping now to get Bert wired. The last time he was here, we were experimenting with very low chairs. And as a result, Bert, given his height, ended up spending most of that session looking at the back of his own knees. We're now sort of even here, so it's better. Bert, thank you so much for that conversation. I'm sure it will spark a discussion. If I can ask you to simply raise your hands, those of you who would like to speak, I will call upon you, wait for the microphone, and we are webcasting this. The camera is right back there, so please hold the microphone up close to your mouth and speak quite clearly. Introduce yourself. And do you have someone in the back there?
Yes.
We'll start there.
Hi, my name is Manik Mehta. I'm a journalist. You made a reference to the downing of the MH370. What is the official position of the Dutch government? And have you been able to determine what caused it or who caused it? Thank you.
I'm going to continue on and take two more questions if we have so many questions to Bert, so just remember that first one. A second one here in the front row.
John Hirsch from IPI. First of all, thank you very much for your remarks. And my comment is not to upend what you have just said, but to add to it. In a major volume that IPI is publishing later this year on the Security Council over the last decade, Sir Adam Roberts from Oxford University has written that the major challenge at the UN is what he calls selective security. In other words, that whatever the UN security takes up on its agenda is based on the interests of the permanent 5 members. And when the permanent 5 members, in his view, do not agree, the issues don't, or when they have an interest in not having an issue come forward, the issue does not come forward. So therefore, the Security Council is kind of limited in its action on those issues in which the P5 totally agree or on which 2 of them might abstain. So I wonder if you could comment on that as a major constraint on the work of the Security Council.
And then finally, William Verdone.
Thank you. When you mention diplomacy, I'm thinking of a round table with diplomats seated, engaged in conversation, compromise, concession, and possibly enlightenment. Who from Boko Haram will be at that table? Who from ISIS and the Islamic State will be at that table, and how do you reach them to join? Thank you.
Very good. We'll take all 3 of those questions and we'll go get 3 more in a bunch. By the way, Bert, if I can expand upon John Hirsch's question, you and I were talking a little bit in the side room about Security Council reform, and we mentioned the French proposal for restraining the use of the veto. In answering John, if you could just include a bit of your thoughts about Security Council reform. The first question, though, was about the plane.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very important question, because I think we should not forget, not only because it concerns almost 200 of citizens of my country, but also of many other countries in the world, what happened when this plane was shot down. And I appreciate therefore this question. And the answer to your question has to be done in a very professional and a way that shows that we take the investigation of this shooting down of a plane very seriously. That's why I cannot answer your question at this point, who is responsible for this. We have an investigation team that has worked intensively in the Ukraine, but also in The Hague, and in close cooperation with other countries through the so-called joint investigation team. These countries as Australia, Malaysia, but also obviously we had to work with the Ukraine to get the wreckage and all that. The access to that was very complex. And as we speak, there's an independent investigation that takes place in the context of this cooperation with other countries, which is primarily based in the Netherlands by an independent group that investigates this, which is a Dutch structure, but as I said, in cooperation with other countries. And which hopes to report later this year to make very clear, on the basis of very deep investigations, what happened exactly, because we have to have a proof that is without any reasonable doubt. That takes a little time, but it's better that it takes a little bit time and to be very clear, so that we can hopefully ascertain without any doubt the responsibility, and that is the second part of it, in a legal process. So there's the investigation, where we hope that will hopefully lead to a report somewhere around June or July. I can give you the exact date, but it's an enormous work. You need the wreckage, you need all the information sharing from countries around the world. I want to underline the importance of the fact, and this shooting down of that plane has also been part of discussions in the Security Council. We do this in a completely objective way. That's why it's important to mention. So that we can, and that's the second part, in a legal process, ensure that those who are responsible for this are in front of a judge at some point in time, and better sooner than later, obviously. So thank you for that very important question. The second is on security sector Security Council reform. You were referring to Adam Roberts. I think he's at least half right, and maybe even a little bit more than that. It's obviously the case that, and maybe there are others here in the room that are members of the Security Council, have just recently been non-permanent members of the Security Council. In the end, it's obviously the members who decide what crises are the most important to them, permanent and non-permanent members together, and decide on the course of action. So I think it's true. Obviously, I remember when I was working on Mali and on other places, you need a country in the Security Council, at least one, that takes that crisis very seriously. Does it mean in the modern time and age that simply only the 5 permanent members of the Security Council can decide what is on the agenda or not? I don't think so. I think we live in a world where power has shifted, where there is international public opinion, where there are relationships between conflicts in a specific area and wider ramifications that might in any case impinge on the interests also of the Security Council members. But, and that's the other side of it, it shows at the same time that we need a very legitimate representation of the world community in the Security Council. That's why we are talking such a long time about reform, because if you reform, there are some countries that lose power and the others that gain. And obviously that creates one of the issues that we're all very aware of. Look, on Security Councils, there are very many models. Let me just say a few criteria that I think maybe many of us would agree on, if not everybody, because the devil is always in the details. In any case, for my country, it is crucial that there is this Security Council reform, that the Security Council is more representative. I think in the end, maybe not immediately, we will have to go in a direction also of one seat for the European Union, even if that's not happening immediately. You know, in different stages, I think that is important. I believe also that, and not before 2017 and 18, by the way, but immediately afterwards. But this is more as a joke, because I really think this is a very serious issue. We have to go in that direction. I think it is silly. It is completely silly and actually not serious that Africa or Latin America or enormous rising continents and powers are not represented. I mean, it's simply unacceptable. We know the different formulas, we know the different propositions that have been made, but my feeling would be that you need a Security Council that is also not too big, maybe just above 20 members, not more than that, that we should not expand the veto power, the veto to many other countries, because that would actually make the Security Council less effective. At the same time, we should also be more clear about the delimitation of the veto power of the present powers, if they would keep them at all. And one of the examples of that is the French proposal, which I highly respect. First of all, I think it's absolutely crucial that if there is a veto, it's at least publicly explained. That's the first step. There are certain vetoes. Well, we have an idea why there is a veto, but there's a need also in terms. We're living in the 21st century. There has to be a public responsibility in terms of why a veto in exceptional circumstances has to be used. Second, it's I think extremely important that in the case of mass atrocities, the use of veto is in principle avoided. And if somehow somebody wants to use the veto, again, there is much more pressure on that country to explain and to reduce that capacity. There's much more to be said about that, but in my view, Adam Roberts' analysis is in essence correct. It's maybe slightly more complicated. We live in a more complex world, so it's not just that 5 members, even when they are in the Security Council, are the only ones who can decide. But definitely they have a larger stamp on which crises are addressed and in what way than others. And I think we have to go to a system which is more logic. I mean, if you look to peacekeeping operations, there is something, as an example, something awkward there. There are certain countries that decide on the mandate more than others. There are others that finance, and there are others that give the troops. In itself, that doesn't have to be negative, or that is not an impossibility, but there has to be a logic to that in a sharing of obligations and responsibilities. And I think, at least from my country's perspective, we have to clarify that. There are many examples, and we can go into details. Obviously, we know the different groups that have put forward specific proposals. But since the last 10 years, we haven't made much progress. And I think it's important that it is put again at the top of the international agenda. The United Nations needs that reform. But I would also say let's not hide behind the need for reform, not to progress on other areas. I think that's also important. The world is so complex, and there's so many issues around climate, about development, that I fully understand those who are frustrated by this lack of change, but maybe the dynamics of the lack of change can also be enhanced by working actively in all areas, climate, development, peacekeeping, and also through that mechanism, gain the power that is necessary to be part of a responsible world community and its security and its decision-making structures. Last but not least, on talking. It's a very difficult question. Frankly, you mentioned the two most difficult groups at the moment, ISIS and Boko Haram. I don't think you can sit with them around the table. I'm not saying that even from a principled point of view, but I don't think they're interested. I think part of their logic is not to talk and to have a completely different frame in terms of discussing issues. Does it mean we shouldn't talk? Let's talk about these two. First of all, ISIS. It's clear, in my view, it is important, and I think that's the majority, vast majority of the countries in the world, the vast majority of the populations of the world, that the way ISIS has treated and become a phenomenon with enormous risks, especially for the Islamic world, but also for the wider world community, it has to be contained and destroyed. Is there the problem solved? No. If we want peace in Syria, in Iraq, in the end, it means a political solution to issues. And that means, for instance, those groups that have felt marginalized for sometimes very legitimate reasons. I think, for instance, about the marginalizations of certain Sunni-oriented groups in northern Iraq. Of course, they should be part of an inclusive government in Iraq. That's the positive development we see also. I was just in Baghdad a week ago. There is the former Prime Minister, Mr. Maliki, has now been succeeded by a Prime Minister who wants to be more inclusive. There is a sense of many areas in which people feel marginalized. And they become what sometimes is called accidental terrorists. And sometimes also accidental tourists, unfortunately. I think it's actually a proper thing. In northern Mali, Mali is a country, for those who know it well, I hope my Malian colleagues are here, is in itself a country which has always been really peaceful, and where when there were conflicts, they were able to accommodate this. And we have had a succession of rebellions in Mali. But these rebellions became part of a globalized structure of criminal economy, of radicalization, and through that mechanism, it became an asymmetric conflict with enormous risks for the population in Mali and for the international community. Therefore, only a political solution in that country can work. That means talking to the rebels, yes. Talking to communities that feel marginalized, yes. But it's much more difficult to talk to those who have exploited that and do not want to talk, but want the opposite. So I think the fact that we do not speak in practice to ISIS or to Boko Haram doesn't mean there should be not and that is, I think, the heart of the work of the United Nations, diplomatic and political solutions to issues, without forgetting that sometimes the military instrument is necessary, but is always limited in its leading to more sustainable solutions.
Excellent. We'll take 3 more questions. Start with Jeff Laurenti, and then Cora, and then the gentleman here. So 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you, Minister. I wonder if we could take advantage of your current status as a national political figure to give us a sense of the political lens in Europe on the kinds of global issues that you've been raising. In the first decade of the century, Europe was really the engine, the motor for the progressive institution building globally, whether it be on climate change or international criminal justice or peacekeeping. But one senses over the past half dozen years, with the rise of an extreme right that did shockingly well in Euro parliamentary elections last year, the kind of Euro panic over Islam that we've heard amplified since the Paris shootings, and even on the respectable right, the kind of Northern European insistence on fiscal austerity that has been created depression-like conditions in Mediterranean Europe. What is the kind of political space, to use a word with which you had begun your lecture, within Europe for the kinds of global engagement, the kinds of investment and development, the kinds of climate change initiatives that will have some kind of negative traction? What do you think are the prospects for containing this kind of nativist, reactionary movement on the political right in so much of Europe, and particularly the engine countries of Northern Europe?
Excellent. Secondly, Cora, the microphones are right behind you.
Thank you very much. I'm Cora Weiss. I love your dedication to 1325. One of the highlights of my life was being among the small group of civil society women who drafted it in 2000.
Congratulations.
No, congratulations to you for helping to implement it. So my question is, how can we get the United Nations to remember the dedication of the Charter, which says determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war? Just as the world community has basically abolished slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, is it possible to abolish the institution of war?
And by the way, Bert, thank you very much for that shout out to IPI for this study we did on women in peace negotiations. The 2 women who did that, Andrea O'Sullivan and Maria O'Reilly, are both in Geneva today at a meeting on that subject. But I really appreciate, by the way, that study they did showed that not only were there very small numbers of women involved in peace negotiations, but showed that the negotiations that involved women were generally more successful than those that didn't. I had a third question there.
Thank you, Minister. Matthew Scott with World Vision, International Relief and Development Organization. You mentioned your appetite for UN reform, and you also mentioned peacekeeping quite a bit, and the need to broaden our tool set beyond military ones. But I didn't hear you talk about the peace-building architecture. In a year with many reviews, it's often forgotten that the peace-building architecture is also up for review this year. The Commission, the Fund, the Support Office, and so forth. Can you say more about the Kingdom of Netherlands' position on how to balance peacekeeping, peace-building, and the other tools in the toolkit of peace-building and development?
Thank you.
Maybe the first question first. Let me say one thing very clear on Europe. And I'm saying this not as a European that always defends our own continent. I'm not a Euro-nationalist or fanatic. But I will also say something where I think you are right. But let me assure you, Europe is not becoming a museum. We are not becoming sclerotic. We are not becoming racist and xenophobic. It's important to say, because especially on the issues that we are mentioning today, it's very key that the European Union and the United Nations are, in my view, key partners of each other. We still have a similar outlook. If I go to the ministers of foreign affairs in Europe, and we talk about development institutions, about human rights, about peace and development and so on, we are very close to the views of the international community. We still have a large commitment. We're still the largest donor, and I don't mean that it's a good thing in itself. We have modernized development cooperation. It can never be as it used to be, sort of the old top-down, supply-driven type of development expertise. But I think really, in that sense, also in building a reformed United Nations, Europe is not out of the game. Does it mean that nothing changed? Yes. I think like the world changed, Europe changed. Part of it is very good, because other powers in the world became more important. We are out of a Eurocentric, Atlantic-centric world. We're going into a world which is much more multifaceted. I'm happy about that. I mean, I've been years working as a Dutch Minister for Development Cooperation in fostering a world that is much more multi-powered and multifaceted than it is right now. So yes, we lose some relative power, there's no doubt about it. The norms and values of Europe are not automatically seen as the norms and values of the world. Yes, that's correct. People have also in other parts of the world something to tell us. I learn every day from Africa, from Latin America, from other places when I visit it. Then thirdly, on the issue of the extreme right and all that, of course I take that very serious, and I think it's a risk. And it is a risk which you do not find only in Europe, but across the world. I think people, and there I think we have to learn a lesson together as a world community. It's not all at once that in Europe or in the US or in Africa or in the Middle East, people become almost all of now xenophobic, and they don't want to talk to others, and it's your own group first. We have to understand why in a globalized world people take risk at the moment more, find risk more important than opportunity. Somehow in their basic security, in terms of norms and values, in terms of economic opportunity or recognition, you find in many countries that people become more protective of themselves. Is that good or bad? Who am I here in New York to judge that as a cosmopolitan sitting going to the United Nations and saying, listen, all our people are becoming? No. You have to realize where their concerns come from. And in my view, those concerns are directly related to the core of the work of the United Nations. Not that the United Nations as a world government can deal with all that, but it should help to steer those elements of global governance in terms of protection of civilians, a respect for different cultural interpretations of universal rights, dialogue, but also harder measures like using the military instrument, unfortunately, sometimes when it is necessary to protect civilians. That, we show people also that there's something protective about the United Nations and the world community. And people stand not alone. And if people feel standing alone and politics is not sufficiently representing them, or therefore the United Nations or the European Union or whatever government you have in the world, there's worldwide a certain questioning about, politics. Let's take it seriously. I take those citizens seriously, and I want to represent them as a foreign minister too. They have their concerns as well. I know it's a general answer, but I just wanted to mention. And 1325, well, first of all, I'm honored to meet with you. I think you are at the core. If you have been standing for this, it's very important. And you are right, the work is not over. I think the norms are there, the institutions, the women's groups, but not only the women's groups, also the men have a quite important role to play there. There's a lot of work to do, but you started it, and then I wouldn't say the rest is history because that's too early to say. But I want to commend what you're saying, and I'm going to do propaganda a little bit as a Dutch, campaigner for the Security Council. We will put this strongly forward. We actually have an important meeting on that this afternoon. Look, is the scourge of war? Yes, that's I think the key element of the United Nations Charter. It's not for nothing. United Nations was built again after the defeat of the League of Nations, and then after the horrible wars in the world in 40-45, came with this crucial charter. It's very difficult to predict this, obviously. Let me say two things of that. We were looking, I think, at a world for some time in which at least the wars between states became less and less apparent. Totalitarian war with millions of victims have been reduced substantially. If you look to the figures, the amount of conflicts in the world, not only interstate but also inside states, have been reduced. There's an enormous amount of also cautious optimism. However, people are not all once good. And we need the structures, we need the governments, we need the United Nations to ensure that we limit the developments that can lead to new forms of warfare. And I come to a last point on this. We are now looking at a world in which war has a different form. Doesn't mean traditional war is impossible. We will have to say, those who want to predict, very nice, I can do it. Maybe there is a new politics of spheres of influence and power politics in Eastern Asia, also as we see on the eastern parts of Europe at the moment. But what concerns me more is at the same time this hybrid warfare in which common crime, marginalization, terror and extremism in combination with the pathology of some ways of instrumentalization of social media is a very strong force for some people in this world. And that is very difficult to fight. And I think we have to talk together how we do that as a sort of innovation, if you wish, an actualization of what we have to do to make sure that the UN Charter remains actual for our citizens. Then PBSO. Look, I think there's been major innovations in the United Nations system. I am positive about what sometimes that's always the problem with the United Nations, also with national politics. You never get the praise, it's always the problem when something goes wrong. There is a PBSO. I think there's been working a leadership on conflict prevention, UNDP and others. Enormous new movement of thinking about how you deal with peace building. And I think actually that the United Nations has been at the forefront of this. Am I without criticism? Of course not. I've seen in Ivory Coast, in Mali, but also in other places that we're not yet up to standards. I didn't know there was a review. I should probably know. Don't mention this because I'm still advocating our leadership in the UN Security Council. So I didn't know it was a review. But let me assure you of one thing. The PBSO helped us tremendously at the time. It's the Peace Building Support Office, in immediately doing things that you can do as peacekeepers, namely issues that deal with early recovery, with police, with justice, with that enormous element which has been strengthened, I think, in the United Nations Secretariat around the three elements that I think the World Bank has put forward as the key elements of fragile states and recovery: jobs, security, and justice. But if you want to give me one line on this only, if that is correct, with all the complexities and the priorities that these governments have, where to start? I don't think it's a bad idea to deal with jobs, security, and justice, and to work more as one UN with peacekeeping operations about how we do that in practice. Now, that sounds very vague, but I have quite some ideas about it, because I've seen that in essence it remains very compartmentalized. The UN development system and the UN peacekeeping system are still strangers on the ground, even if they say they're not, but they are, with different timelines, with different priorities. And people expect from us a credibility of a system that gets its act together on peace building and support.
Excellent. We'll take three more. I'll start with Bill Pace and some others who they're in the second row and they're in the third row.
Thank you, Minister. On this very last point, I can't resist but to say in 2005, I think one of the unfortunate developments in establishing the Peace Building Commission was that there was barely an informal, but certainly no formal role for non-governmental organizations to have any kind of a consultative relationship. And I think it would very much benefit if there is some discussion on that in the 10-year review. But as an international NGO that has had offices and headquarters in the Netherlands since 1950, we can strongly endorse Warren's comments in his introduction. I'd also want to express very strong support for your ministry and your UN mission especially in the work it's been doing on international justice and the International Criminal Court, on the responsibility to protect, and as you mentioned today, on the efforts to reform the United Nations institutions for maintaining peace and security. And then briefly on that, I think it's very important, as you said, on the veto restraining issue, but also the general improvement of the working methods of the Security Council, and that they ought to be separated, as important as the representation issues are in the Council, and they are vitally important. But the working methods should be separated from the tortured politics on the expansion of the Council, and I think that would be a very helpful development. And the expansion issue, I think, will not help us get the strongest sustainable development summit goals this year. And so as important as it is, I think it would be best to put that on a different track than the negotiations in 2015. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much for
Can I
a
ask you
very...
to stand so we can hear? Thank you.
Soroush Roshan, founding president of International Health Awareness Network, a native of Iran. Thank you for a very informative talk this morning. I thank IPI as well. My question is, in the reform planning for the United Nations and Security Council, are women considered to be given better chances? Is there a hope that we will have a president of Security Council, a woman? And is it possible that United Nations will follow the gender equality in having women in high positions? Thank you.
And Udo Jans.
Thank you very much. Minister, thank you very much for this tour de France that you gave us today. You mentioned the fallout from the conflicts of last year, which have reached unprecedentedly high figures of refugees and internally displaced in the course of last year. One of your former prime ministers was High Commissioner for Refugees and tried during his time as High Commissioner to continue what Madame Mogata had started, namely to bridge the relief to development divide. We all knew then, and we know today, that we cannot absorb the world's refugees without bridging that gap, because we need to help governments in development assistance to absorb the number of refugees. Jordan, that you will feature later on today, is a case in point. 80% of the refugees in Jordan live outside of the traditional camp setting. They live in households. They consume electricity, they need to pay rent, they need to send their kids to school, they need the hospital infrastructure, etc. You mentioned the summit that you want to organize in Holland, and I wonder to what extent the humanitarian envelope that goes hand in hand with the development budget needs to come together finally, not only budgetary-wise, but also in the SDGs, in the post-2015 development goals, where the SG has said, leave no one behind. We're talking over 50 million of the world's dispossessed who are refugees and IDPs today. It's about time that we include them in the world's development goals. Thank you.
Take those three, and if we do it fast, we'll have room for a few more.
Yes, thank you very much for they're all very complex, difficult, but very actual and important questions that I really appreciate. First of all, on the role of civil society in non-governmental organizations. Look, let me not just say, because it's good to say so, that they're important, everybody says that. From my experience on the early recovery phase and the real work, it's the NGOs that do it. In the difficult circumstances, in the difficult situations. They are on the ground, nobody else. And therefore, I feel very much by what you're saying, that this real coordination and discussion on how we work together in post-conflict fragile states is absolutely important. It's not just a ritual of UN agencies or governments talking with NGOs. It's really, can we set together priorities? Can we fund them, and do we respect each other's relative autonomy in this? I know this is not a real answer to your question, but I think it's absolutely essential that we look at it that way. They're partners. and not partners for diplomatic reasons, partners, I would say, not in crime, but in doing things that are necessary to advance, especially the issues that you were referring to. Second, security sector reform, a security council. Sorry, I make that mistake all the time because I was so much in security sector reform. It's absolutely a priority, but it doesn't mean everything else. I try to say that it has to wait for that. If we're talking about the MDGs, about the new agenda for development, including issues of equity and ecology and fragile states, I think there's those three key areas. Obviously, we cannot wait for that. To the contrary, we have to advance it and create the dynamics that come with that. That requires also is security sector, security council reform. I'm sorry. So I think that's absolutely important. This agenda has to be politicized too. I've been for years member as a minister for development cooperation. Development cooperation is a highly political file. You work with colleagues in different countries around very highly political issues. Water, land, fragile states development. And we have done together a Busan agreement in 2011, which modernized this, which is the developing countries in whatever form are not the victim or object of this, but they are the demandeur. And we should respect completely their sovereignty. This whole issue of supply and demand driven is still an issue that is absolutely crucial. Who is going to accept this sort of traditional way of dealing with aid? Nobody, incorrectly so. We live in a different world of emancipation of countries, and I cherish that, even if that can create certain conflict sometimes. Secondly, on women's, look, I don't think I can promise you a woman as a president of the Security Council would mean when we do our campaign that I should make sure that our permanent representative is a woman, and then she can become the chair. Now, behind you on your right was a former woman who was president of the Security Council. And she did a great, but now we get into a trouble because she was just very good. And not because she was a woman or a man. We just want a balance of people who represent the world who can do this, and women are disadvantaged there. So I agree with you on all this. I would just say on a few areas in the development field that have been underrated, again financially, although we promised differently, is again the Millennium Development Goal 5 on. And that is something that deals with women because it's maternal mortality. For me, it's still a shame that, in fact, in terms of financing, on improving health systems, and on delivery, this is still we are still there where we are. There, the MDGs have done some, but not sufficiently on all these areas. There's some progress. But I'm amazed that in all conflict areas where you come, but also beyond that, that issue is the last one people are interested in. They say differently, they don't do. The third point was on, you just see, UNHCR, yes, and refugees. Look, this is in the end becoming a much more political issue, and correctly so. The UNHCR has the personal responsibility for so many, 50 million, it's more than anything we've seen, I think, you are the expert, but since the Second World War. I was just in Erbil and in Amman, and also in eastern Turkey. Let me first say one thing. If you talk about an orchestra of agencies and countries to take responsibility, I have high admiration for the governments that have taken in so many refugees without any complaint. The majority of the refugees there remain in home communities with families. I can criticize left and right, but I think it is an enormous asset what they have been doing. So I compliment these governments that do that. Secondly, it is very key that we think also what that means, but you are the expert more than I am, much more. I saw, for instance, in eastern Turkey, but also in Jordan, that we can help people that are with those communities. The Dutch government supported service centers, so in terms of health, in education, in follow-up, in topping up schools, with the risk always that refugees feel that, the local communities feel that people are better treated than the refugees, all these kind of dilemmas. We need to think through, I think, a little bit better how we deal with those communities that take in refugees and are not in camps. It's only one small element. On humanitarian summits and all that, and refugees, I still think that, and we should honor one person really also here today, is Antonio Gutierrez, who's done, for so many years, treated the most complex refugee issue, Syria, underfinanced, understaffed, with sometimes, not the type of cluster approach and cooperation that you really want in practice. Nobody to blame, by the way. And in which countries, we were talking about it, become, that's why I made an exception for those countries, but become rather more than less xenophobic, and very quickly say we cannot carry the burden of all these refugees. He sits in a very difficult situation. And I think UNHCR, again, the humanitarian support, protected refugee situations and early recovery, that nexus of issues requires in an agenda even more political integrated approaches. And it's easy to say now, I realize that, to mention that in words, and it's difficult to do it. I think that's the thing we need, and where our country stands also for in terms of our ideas for the United Nations.
But unfortunately, we are out of time, and so I can't take any more questions. I just want to say in closing exactly what I said when I interviewed Bert a year and a half ago here. You are welcome to come back here anytime. You don't need a new job or a new country. That was fascinating.
Thank you very much.